In this video, we'll talk about cookies and session tracking. Let's first understand what session tracking is. In many situations, a web application needs to remember the past activities of a user. For example, a user of an online store may add an item to a shopping cart, browse the store a little bit more, then add another item to the shopping cart. The web application needs to remember the user so it doesn't add the item to somebody else's shopping cart. It also needs to remember what the user did before, so the first item the user added is still in the shopping cart. If you did some network programming before, you may think this is easy to do because there would be a continuous connection between the client and the server. And for each client, there would be a thread or process on the server that handles just that client. Unfortunately, the HTTP protocol is not designed that way. HTTP is so-called stateless, meaning that the server handles each request individually, and after a request is handled, the server immediately forgets about the request and the client who sent the request. The connection between a client and a server usually lasts only a few seconds at most. The statelessness of HTTP is an important reason why the protocol is so efficient and scalable, but it also makes it impossible for tracking users by HTTP itself. So what can we do? The trick is that instead of maintaining a constant connection between the client and the server will issue a unique identifier to each client. This identifier is usually called a session ID, and whenever the client sends a request to the server, it includes a session ID as part of the request. By looking at the session ID, the server would know which client the request comes from. The way it works is illustrated in this example. Note that the first request does not have a session ID, so the server knows it's from a new client. The server would generate a new session ID, which is typically a unique random number, and send it back to the client as part of the response. All subsequent requests from the client will include the session ID, and this establishes a virtual session between the client and the server. Because of the way this virtual session works, it can be terminated by either the client or the server. For example, the client may decide not to include a session ID in a request. Then the server will treat the request as the start of a new session. The server can also decide to forget a session ID, that is, not to recognize it in the future request, in which case the session is also terminated. There are several ways to implement session tracking: URL rewriting, hidden form fields, and using cookies. URL rewriting is to change the hyperlinks embedded in a web page to include an additional session ID, as shown here. So when a user clicks on a link, the request would include the session ID as part of the URL. URL rewriting is pretty hard to implement from scratch, as you would have to dynamically change the hyperlinks on a web page. The hidden form field approach is basically what we did in the edit entry part of the guestbook example. When the edit form is generated, you embed a hidden form field to include an additional parameter session ID. So when the form is submitted, the session ID will be sent back to the server as a request parameter. This approach, of course, only works when you have a form to begin with. The most common and most reliable way to do session tracking is to use the so-called cookies. A cookie is really just a small piece of text that is sent between a server and the browser. The server can send the cookie to the client using a response header setCookie, and the browser will automatically include the cookie in all future requests to the server as a request header. Here's an example of a response having a setCookie header. Notice that the content or the value of the header is a cookie name with a cookie value with a little bit additional information about the cookie. And here's what a cookie header looks like in a request. Again, the value of the header contains a cookie name and a cookie value. You can see the cookies set for a page using the developer tools of your browser. For example, this is CSNS, and CSNS sets several cookies. We can see the cookies by going to developer tools and see the application tab. Under the application tab, there are a bunch of things, including cookies. If we expand it here, we can see the cookies set by this page, csns.castledala.edu. In fact, this page sets quite a few cookies. The most important thing about a cookie are the name and the value. Here, for example, I have a cookie name called default-department, and the value is CS. So this user by default belongs to the CS department. In addition to name and value, there are some additional attributes about a cookie. The host and path attributes determine whether a cookie should be included in a request. For example, we can see here the domain is cs.castledala.edu and the path is /. What this means is that this cookie will only be included if a request is sent to the site cs.castledala.edu to a path that's anywhere under this path. So because this path is the root path, so any path is under this path. That means any request to this domain will have this cookie included. There are a few additional attributes that determine, for example, whether the cookie should be sent only over secure connection or it can be sent over any type of connection. And there's an expiration attribute shows the expiration date of the cookie. The Servlet API provides a cookie class and we can use this class to create a cookie to get various information out of a cookie using all the getters, and of course we can also set the attributes of the cookie, and to create a cookie we can simply give it a name and a value. And there are also methods in the HTTP request and response classes which we can use to add a cookie to a response or retrieve cookies included in a request. Now let's look at an example. In this example, when a user first visits a page, we'll ask for their name. We'll put the name in a cookie, so if the user visits the same page later, we'll say hello instead of displaying the form. Let's see how we can do this. I'll create a servlet and we'll call this servlet who are you? And we'll have both do get and do post. So in do get, we'll do two things. We'll first check if there's already a cookie called name. If yes, display hello name. If no, display a form. And let's do the first part. In order to check for a cookie, we'll need to say get cookie. Notice that get cookies, there's no get cookie method in request. There's only one called get cookies, which returns all the cookies in a request as an array. And if there's nothing in the request, we actually have to check if this array is null. If it's null, then we'll need to go through each. If it's not null, we'll have to go through each cookie and get the name of the cookie and then get the value of the cookie and so on. So it's better to actually put this in a method. So let's do that. We'll say this method will get name from cookie, and this one, let's say it will take a HTTP servlet request. And inside here, we'll say cookie array is cookies, and the request get cookies. Let's import that. And then we'll say if cookies is not null, and then we'll say for each cookie in cookies, if cookie get name equals to name, will return the cookie value. And if there's no cookie, or if we don't find any cookie with the name, we just return no. Okay, so this method will give us the cookie value if there's a cookie called name. And here we can then simply say name is get name from cookie request. Now, if this one is not null, we can display the name, and if it is, we'll display a form. And again, let me copy over some code so that we don't have to write everything from scratch. And we'll have the content type, we'll have the writer, we'll have who are you, and if name is not null, meaning that we got a cookie, and then we simply display hello plus name plus this. So this would be it. If it is indeed null, then we need to display a form. So it will look something like this. We'll say form, the action is going to be this servlet itself, so we don't need action. We do need method because we want to post, and this one will say what's your name. So let's say your name, and then we'll have the input, we'll have the name, and then we'll have a button called submit. And then we need to close the form. So something like that. We'll see. So this will do the display. But notice that there's nowhere in our code that sets a cookie. And that, of course, is something that we need to do in doPost if the user submit the form. So here we'll say if the user submit the form, we'll get the name from request parameter. The request parameter will become name, and then we'll need to create a cookie and then set it. Remember the API for that would be new cookie and then add cookie. So we'll create a new cookie. And the name of the cookie is going to be name, and the value will be whatever the user has submitted. And then we'll say response add cookie, and we'll add this cookie. And then we'll say response send redirect, and we'll redirect the user back to do get. That means we are going to redirect the user back to you. Okay, so let's see how it looks. We'll run this. And let's run it here so we can see the cookie here. So right now there's no cookie. Notice that the URL is localhost 8080. And then let's say my name is John, and we submit. So notice that now we have a cookie with cookie name and cookie value John. And now if we go back to who are you, that means if we go back to here, it will get the cookie and prints out hello John. So this is how we can set a cookie and how we can get it later and then make some usage of it. So cookie is a pretty good way to track users. But are there any problems that we need to be aware of? Well, first of all, cookies will not cause security problems. A cookie is just a piece of text sent between a browser and a server. It's never executed by the server, so it cannot be used to spread virus. Also, all browsers have limits on the size of a cookie and how many cookies a site can set on your computer. So a malicious site cannot do a denial of service attack by setting lots of cookies on your computer to run out of your disk space. With that said, cookies are widely used by online advertisers to track users' online behaviors, so it is indeed a privacy concern. Usually, your browser will provide some options for you to customize how cookies are handled. For example, if you go to Settings and search for cookies, there are some settings you can set to say whether you allow cookies or whether you allow certain type of cookies, and so on and so forth. Besides security and privacy, there are also some technical problems when we use cookies directly in web applications. First, cookies have size limit, so you cannot store too much data in a cookie. And because cookies are stored on the client side, it's easy for malicious users to change or fake cookies. Sometimes cookies are disabled by users, so you cannot use it at all. And on top of those, the cookie API in Servlet is not particularly easy to use, especially when you try to get a cookie from a request, like what we saw from our example. You have to go through all the cookies and check for no cookies and all that. To address these issues, Servlet provides a session tracking API. Here are the 4 most important methods in this API. In HTTP Servlet request, you can call getSession, and this will return the current session or create a new one if there's no existing session. Once you have a session, you can associate any data with the session by calling setAttribute and getAttribute. And of course, if you want to terminate the session, you can call invalidate. Note that the API getAttribute and setAttribute are very much like how we store and access data in application scope. In fact, the data associated with a session is called in the session scope. Later on, we'll see the difference between application scope and session scope, but in terms of the API, they are very similar. They both use getAttribute and the setAttribute. Here are a few things about session tracking API. First, the data is stored on the server. That means there's no size limit. You can associate lots of data with a particular session. Also, each session is assigned a unique session ID, which is used to access data associated with the session. The session ID is randomly generated and is hard to fake. You can see what a session ID looks like if we again go to CSNS and see the cookies set by CSNS. Notice that this is what a session ID looks like. That this session ID is generated by Servlet API's session tracking API. You can see that it's not easy to just fake a session ID. And one more thing about session tracking API, it uses cookie by default, but it can automatically switch to URL rewriting if cookie is disabled by the browser. So that's a pretty useful feature. Now, let's see how to use session tracking API using our guestbook example. This is a guestbook example we saw from last time. I simplified the example a little bit by remove the edit and delete part, and let's only look at the display and add comment. So here I can add a new comment, and if I try to add another comment, currently the code will ask me to enter my name again. So let's say that we want to change this by using session tracking API to remember the user's name. So next time, if the user tries to leave another comment, the application will automatically remember the user's name. So let's see which part of the code we need to change. Of course, we don't need to change the display part, so this will be the code we need to change. Again, before we write anything, let's look at the, well, whether you call it pseudocode or whether you call it the outline. So what we want to do here is look for name in session. If it's there, do not display name input field. Otherwise, display name input field. Quite simple. So we'll still need this part. We'll still need the form, and whether we display this or something else is decided by whether we can find the name in session. So we'll say request get session and get attribute, and we'll look for an attribute called name. Actually, let's do it this way. So we'll say name is request get session get attribute name, and just like getting data out of application scope, it returns an object type. We'll need to pass it to a string type. So we'll say if name is null, meaning that we have not stored name in session, then we display this. Else, we simply display name is name and new line. Okay, so the rest of the code will be the same. Now let's look at do post. Notice that here the name could either come from form or it could come from session. So again, we'll need to check. The first thing we do is we'll do this check again. Let's try to get name from session first. If name is not in session, that means the name must come from the form. So we'll do this one. Notice that if the name comes from the form, once we get the name, we do want to save it in the session. So we'll say request get session set attribute, and the attribute will be called name, and it's going to be called name. Do we need an else? We don't really need an else, because either way, we are going to have a name at this point. So after this if, wait, so if name is null, okay, so this is not null. So if we get the name from session, then we won't execute this if block. However, if we don't get it, name would be null, so we will be inside this if block, in which case we get the name from the form, and then we save the name in session. Okay, so this is how it looks like. And let's see if this thing works. Okay, so I'm going to add a comment, and right now there's nothing in the session, so it will display the form. So let's say I'm Tom and I say hi. And if I try again, so notice that now Tom is saved in the session, and this time it will show Tom. And then I can say hello. Okay, so this is how it works. What I want to show, however, is not just how to use a session, but very importantly, the difference between session scope and application scope. Notice that in this browser, we are seeing 4 entries, and all 4 entries are stored in application scope. And again, in this browser, if I try to add a new comment, I see the user's name, and this one is stored in the session scope. What if we try with a different browser? Notice that if I try a different browser, I see the same 4 entries, here, meaning that in a different browser, we see the same application scope data. However, if I click Add Comment, notice that we are not seeing Tom in this browser. And this, let's say, is Steve, and Steve says hello, and Steve says hello here. And if I refresh here, I can see what Steve just said. And if I add comment, it still says Tom. And if I add comment, it says Steve. So this is basically the difference and similarities about application scope data and session scope data. Data in application scope and session scope can both be accessed by all servlets, but they have an important difference. For application scope data, all users see the same data, but for session scope, it's specific to a particular user, or in other words, each user sees their own session scope data. You can simulate 2 users using 2 browsers or using 1 browser, but the private or incognito browsing mode used inside the browser, and you'll see the difference. And because of this difference between application scope and session scope, you can see that certain data should be stored in application scope, while certain data should be stored in session scope. For example, for an online store, all users should see the same products, so products should be stored in application scope. But each user should have their own shopping cart, so shopping cart data should be in the session scope. One more thing about session is session timeout. If a user doesn't interact with a web application for a certain amount of time, by default, the session will time out. The default session timeout in Tomcat is 30 minutes, and you can change the default value in web.xml file by adding a session config element to it, and this one, for example, would set the default session timeout to 60 minutes or an hour. So this is the end of this video. See you in the next one.